Hi, ladies. Today we're going to continue on with our notes and lecture on the Holocaust, which is continuation after what we just talked about on Japanese American internment. And I know that this is a really serious subject and maybe not one that, you're in the mood for right now because of the situation that we're all in. But I think it's a really good thing when we look at things from a historical perspective, in times of crisis and in times of difficulty, that we realize that, in the grand scheme of things, we're gonna be okay after this. And when you look back at something as horrendous as the Holocaust, I think it puts a lot of things in perspective of our own life. And so that being said, this topic is something that you have covered in previous classes, including world history last year or 2 years ago if you're a junior. And we're looking at basically two things, really. The Holocaust is fundamentally the systematic murder of European Jews, but in the grand plan of Hitler and the Nazis, it was really to exterminate anybody that he considered undesirable. And so there were a total of 12 million people that were murdered because of this policy. 6 million of them, about 2/3 of the European Jewish population, were killed, and another close to 6 million were killed who were labeled undesirable. And that could be any people anywhere from being disabled, the sickly, homosexuals, anybody that wouldn't be part of what he considered to be people that live up to that notion of the perfect race. So this is all founded in anti-Semitism, which is something that Hitler did not invent. Anti-Semitism, unfortunately, has been around since the time of Jesus. And this basically means it's the hatred and discrimination against Jews. And it starts in Germany when the Nazis take over of excluding the Jews from all political, social, and economic life. Concentration camps were a place that are built in Nazi-occupied Germany and other places as, first of all, it becomes a place where political prisoners are kept. So actually one of the first groups of people that were put in concentration camps were the communists. If you recall from when we talked about when he took Germany over, that was like his mortal enemy at first. And then it will be extended to those of the Jewish faith, which Poland will actually become sort of the home for concentration camps and later on the death camps. So the concentration camps are slightly different than what will become known as death camps, because for the most part, at least the first couple of years, it's forced labor. It doesn't mean that people weren't still being murdered and tortured. It's just it was not the primary reason to put people there. So that'll be a little bit different when the other places are built. Kristallnacht, which is the night of the broken glass, is a reference to what happens on November 9th, 1938, when Nazis will loot and destroy Jewish stores, houses, synagogues, and that you learned probably more about in world history. But that's kind of where this, it was already bad before that, but this is sort of like the sort of where the story turns even worse for most people of the Jewish faith. It becomes a genocide when it's a deliberate destruction of an entire ethnic or cultural group, which is what was carried out against European Jews. So as the Nazis control more and more parts of Europe, this plan goes into action. So yes, it starts with German Jews, but it will extend into other parts of Europe as well. So I mentioned just a minute ago the difference between a concentration camp and a death camp. And a death camp, also known as an extermination camp, exists primarily for mass murder. These are places in Poland, specifically Auschwitz, Treblinka, Buchenwald. Those are some infamous camps. You've probably heard of Auschwitz, and that's probably one of the most famous places that is talked about in stories about the Holocaust. There were thousands of people that would arrive every day to these places, and many don't know what is happening, where they're going, what's going to happen to them, what's awaiting for them on the other side. On average, there were 12,000 people gassed per day. And these places were so horrendous because, they literally were constructed to kill thousands of people at a time. So this is not, not that concentration camps are a nice place either, but this was not a place to like house people. This was a place to kill people. Now, some of the camps like Auschwitz also served as a concentration camp too. And I'll show you later an aerial view of Auschwitz. You can see how massive what we're talking about of these camps. This is an aerial view shot of the main camp of Auschwitz. So we're talking about, just a gigantic area of buildings that some were used to house people and most were used to process and in the end gas thousands of people. This video always is but this picture is always very haunting to me because this is a mother and her children that arrive and to a death camp, and they most likely had just gotten off the train. And unfortunately, the majority of children this young will be gassed, along with women. If you were seen, you were kind of processed in a couple different ways. Number one, they looked at you, of course, if you were sick or if you had some type of disability, you were immediately put into processing for the gas chamber. If you were young, there was no need, I guess, for lack of a better term, for young children. And so mothers and children were separated in this process. If you were seen as useful in some way, you may be spared, but you were put in, the work camp, which, from stories I've read and people I have heard in their oral histories, it's like you wanted to die because it was a really horrible, horrible way to live. If you were sorry if you hear my dog barking in the background. If you were seen as somewhat like I don't want to say intriguing, might be a lack of a better word, but like could be used for something that was of Nazi use for. So for example, like if you were an identical twins or even fraternal twins for that matter were experimented on medically. So a lot of like other horrible things that maybe aren't as talked about as much as like the picture here of the gas chamber. This is at Auschwitz, but there were some really horrible things that happened in these camps, let alone the massive murdering of thousands of people. Auschwitz is a museum and memorial now. So a lot of people that travel to Poland, it's one of the places that they visit and pay their respects to the atrocity that happened. And so some of the gas chambers are still standing. And this is a picture of one of them. And so, it's a huge room where they would pump the gas in. And people that have visited there, I personally have never been there, but people that have visited there have said it's extremely haunting because you can see on the walls the nail markings of people who are like kind of trying to scratch their way out. When, these people were put in these gas chambers, it's documented that because there were so many people that they would squish in these spaces, not everybody dies right away. And so some people are actually suffocated to death because of the bodies that fall on top of them, and they're unable to get out because they are starting to lose consciousness. And there's just, again, a lot of really horrible things. So these people, I'm going to back up a minute and say when they're processed, they don't necessarily know like what is going on, because they're told that they have to go and shower, or they're going to be sent to the showers. And that was kind of code for the gas chamber. So some of the chambers were set up to look like showers, but in reality, the like what would be the shower head is actually the gas that's coming out. And a really awful thing. If we were in class, I would ask you what you think this picture is of. And a lot of responses, of course, I get are, bones or bodies or something like that. But if you've ever been to one of the Holocaust museums, you may know what we're looking at is actually a pile of shoes. And so upon arrival and being processed at a death camp, you were told to take off any of your belongings, any jewelry, any shoes. Many were stripped naked because of, like I said, being told that you were going to go shower. So this is just like a visual of the just number of people like we're talking about. And this isn't even anything compared to, in total number of people that were killed. Rescue and liberation does come for the camps. And once Europe has been liberated by the Allies, this will happen. But before that, there is a little bit of criticism for the part of the United States, because for a while we kind of had our borders closed. And you saw, or actually some of you didn't see, but if you're in Blue Day, you got to see at least the first part of that video. If you remember Jack Warner, who was the guy from Austria, and he escaped once Austria was taken over by Germany. And so you did have people that were somewhat able to come here for a while, but eventually the government will close its borders. And that was criticized because, not that like we could predict exactly what the Holocaust was going to be, but it was obvious that there were Jews in Europe that were being that there were things that were happening, that they were being persecuted somehow. So eventually we will get around to this being created, which is the War Refugee Board, and there will be over 200,000 specifically mostly Jews that will come to the US. And again, people criticize the fact, well, it could have been more, and they're right, it could have been more, but under those circumstances, that's like looking back at history and saying like we could have, woulda, shoulda, but that's not what actually happened. So when the camps are liberated, a lot of prisoners, unfortunately, if you were in a concentration or death camp in or labor camp, a lot of people died like the day before liberation, because the German troops that were still there were warned that the Americans were coming, or the Russians were coming, or whoever was liberating the camps. And so they were told to start marching. And these are people that are basically like skeletons that haven't had a real meal in years, for a lot of them. And so a lot of them were sick, and a lot of them were not in good condition. And all of a sudden you're forcing them to to move. And so unfortunately, a lot of them will not see that day of liberation. The trial that happens, this is after the war's over, is called the Nuremberg trials. And I'll show you later on when we're done with the unit little bit more info on that. But this is conducted by an international military tribunal, and this is where they try Nazi leaders. So the higher up, the better. Although, some people in lower ranks were charged with war crimes, and oftentimes their excuse for the Holocaust was, we were just doing what we were told. We were just doing what we were told. And it opens up the question, the morality question of, yes, you're in a government that's dictated by, an insane person that has these policies, but when do you stand up? When do you say no? And their excuse was always like, well, if we didn't do this, we would die. And that wasn't good enough. That wasn't good enough. And so all of the people that stood trial were found guilty, and they were sentenced to death. Since then, in the last almost 80 years, there have been what they called Nazi hunters, or people who have spent their life tracking down Nazis who have escaped since World War II and have lived their lives somewhere else, including here in the United States. There was actually a man that was found, I think it's been probably about a year, maybe 2 years, but he was in his 90s. He lived in New York City. He was known as the bookkeeper, or I'm sorry, the accountant. That was his nickname given to him. And I believe he was at Buchenwald, and he had escaped, had a totally different life here in the United States, had a family, owned a business, was a taxpayer, kind of lived under the radar. And he was arrested, and those that were still living could, pick him out of the lineup. And, they were like, I know who this man is. This man is somebody who took our things. So they called him the accountant because he was the one that took their jewelry and kept like an accounting sheet of all of these items. And so they were in the middle of prosecuting him when he was taken to The Hague, which is I think it's in Switzerland, which is sort of like this world where international crimes, I guess, are tried. And they were in the process of doing all of this when he died, because the guy is like in his early 90s. And so it just goes to show that these crimes of humanity, whether they're committed 80 years ago or they're committed now, there is no, expiration. There's no limitations on justice for what happened. So these are just some pictures just to show you like what the conditions were like if you were in the camp and were living there. Of course, these were, stacked literally from floor to ceiling with people. This is one of the liberation. You see the tanks coming in, the gates, being liberated. I'm trying to see, I'm not sure which camp this was, but in Poland. All right, so that is the end of the notes and lecture for the Holocaust. As always, if you have any questions, please put those in the comments below, or you can send me an email. I hope things are going well for you, and let me know if I can do anything for you. If you need a FaceTime appointment, please send me an email. All right, thanks. I'll catch you next time.